This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
It's Community Pulse on Radio 786 100.4 FM. It's been absolutely fascinating as we've journeyed into unmasking bullying for the past 2 weeks. And just a reminder that these conversations that we've had with clinical psychologist Daniel Den Hollander are available on our YouTube platform. So do yourself a favor. If you are not a subscriber as yet, do go ahead and subscribe. And then, of course, on your own time and at your leisure, you can listen to these conversations and many others, of course, that we have not only on Community Pulse but on 100.4 FM. Today we are continuing that conversation. We have Daniel Den Hollander on the line with us as we continue speaking about the fact that bullying has become a deeply rooted issue, not just within our schools, but in our communities and even our online spaces. So instead of responding only with sort of reactive measures, it's something that we said right at the start, that this is not a knee-jerk response to any particular incident. We want to understand how do we work towards a powerful shift, and that's a counter culture to bullying, which is what we're focusing on this morning. Now, this movement focuses on consciously building environments where kindness, empathy, respect and inclusion are the norm, not the exception. It's about changing mindsets. It's about modeling positive behavior. It's about empowering bystanders to become upstanders and creating a culture where bullying simply cannot thrive. Today we explore what the counterculture to bullying looks like, how it can be actively nurtured, and the role each of us as parents, yes, but also then as collectives, that means schools, communities, the media can play in transforming the spaces that we share. Please do join me on the line with us. Daniel Den Hollander, clinical psychologist. Good morning and welcome. Thank you once again, Daniel, for joining us.
Absolute pleasure, and I'm so happy that we're doing this.
Daniel, I want to open up this conversation with a point that you raised last week, which I told you as I re-listened to that conversation yesterday, I thought to myself, wow, when you spoke about something and you drew from your own experience, where oftentimes the one that is being bullied can be deemed or feel almost like he or she is complicit, because you end up doing something to avoid the bullying. So either complying with what is sort of what you're instructed to do or avoiding it in some way or the other. But this also means that you're further enabling bully type behavior. So there's this constant mistrust, the self-doubt, these contradictions of shame and fear that the bullied constantly feels, even he or she is victim blamed. Now we speak about the counterculture. We speak about the movement where kindness and empathy and respect would be the norm. But then we have to balance it against that. So how do we start that conversation?
I think, that's a good question. How do we start this? And I think, especially because we're on radio, and radio in itself becomes a bit of a neat product, right? Because we want to have a solution, something for the audience to take back. But the reality of it is that the solution isn't a simple, straightforward thing. Never in the history of the world is creating a culture of something else ever something that is direct and quick. But what it calls for is something that starts with core values and then gains momentum. Now, that's just a disclaimer, so it didn't really answer your question. But I think we have to be real about that as well. It's something not that we do in an instance, but it's something that we do incrementally. It's something that we do over time. It's a change of behavior. It's a change of attitude. And I think, I remember that when I was chatting with your producer about how we're going to do this show and what are we going to do and what form is this journey going to take place. I think the thing that psychology has taught me, especially South African psychology, is that nobody likes a curry that comes out of a prepaid package. We need hours and hours to let all those ingredients mix with each other and integrate into each other. Then something incredible comes in, You need to stir fry the spices before you put anything else in. Because if you don't, then you're going to end up with a curry that's just going to bite you. And we all long for the curry where we taste it and enjoy it, and then the bite gets you at the end. You can hear that my Durban blood is coming out.
Clearly.
And in the same way, I think it is in regards with this, is that there are core values that we have to start to deal with. And one of the things that we spoke about with you and myself and with your producer and myself was the importance of not seeing this as an incident, but rather seeing it as the incident as being the snapshot of what is busy happening within our communities, what is busy happening within our city. You know, if we, we often hear the term that Cape Town is a tale of two cities. And in there is already a bullying relationship, superior versus inferior. Those who have, and it almost feels like versus those who have not. And what always surprises me, I mean, South Africa is one of the most beautifully diverse countries in the world. We are really the trailblazers of the big problems that are out there for the rest of the world. We've got to find a way. I almost want to say, with the dramatic soundtrack of a blockbuster movie, the world requires us to find a way together in order for the world to have some sort of answer. I think it's not by mistake that South Africa at this point in time with the current geopolitical difficulties is in a lot of ways trailblazing in regards to how do we do this? How can we do this? And very interestingly, on the basis of the fact that we are allowed to, especially our struggle heroes, are allowed to own the space of what is apartheid and what is not, what is a way forward, what is not. We've earned that right to be able to have that conversation. And I think in a similar way, in regards with this conversation, that those of us who have gone through prejudice, those of us who have gone through bullying, are allowed to have an idea through compassion. How do we find a solution way forward? And it comes back down. I think the start of it is identifying that our enemy isn't an individual this time. It's a mindset. It's a worldview. It's a hierarchical worldview that in this world, we had this idea that some of us are better than others. You think of Orwell's Animal Farm, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than other animals, and it starts with realizing the absolute poison in that kind of mindset and how often that creeps into the way in which we're thinking. And if we can see that mindset is the poison, that mindset is a toxicity, then it brings a beautiful perspective to probably Biko's most famous quotes. The most powerful weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So as long as we stay stuck in that mindset, that is the most dangerous and vulnerable place, not just for us, but, and it's a theme that we're continuing here, is in our children as well, because our children are reflecting us, and we need to come to terms with that. We need to not villainize the children in order to take responsibility off our hands. We need to actually hold that, because it's our job to bring the change in. That's the one thing that adults have. That's why we are independent, because we have a lot more capacity and abilities collectively. Now, not every parent is able to on their own, but collectively we should. But also think about that in a school system. How safe do we feel in an SGB, in a students' governing body, which is supposed to be comprised of us as parents? How much of our core values play out in the school governance body? How much of our core values plays out if we see the school as a community entity and not a financial entity or a business entity. And it unfortunately seems to have come there. Think about also the idea of success. I mean, one of the most famous American writers, and I've forgotten his name, Mark Twain, once said, if a child goes through an education system and learns anything, it's a minor miracle. Okay, now he's very cynical about schooling. He was also famous for saying the only reason we have schools is to keep children from doing mischief, you know. But the reality also in there is that when we derive school as only about performance, statistics, and very sort of government bureaucratic heavy, and it doesn't have to be government. Government's supposed to itself also be community driven, but we still have a few remnants from the apartheid state. But once we start to realize that schooling is not bureaucratic, in fact, each one of us, and I know we'll do a segment in the future about school specifically, but each one of us, it's not the lessons that we remember and that changed our lives. It was the teachers, it was the relationships between teacher and you, having to together deal with the difficulty of how do we learn something that breaks our confidence every time we get it wrong. And learning self-confidence, self-esteem on those levels. But, you know, in the current climate that we have right now, and with the toxicities that are coming into our society right now, like we described also in earlier podcasts, parents being taken away from their kids by being forced to work overtime in order to keep their jobs. Parents having to take second jobs because their income isn't enough to be able to survive. The ever-increasing rental prices that is starting to threaten our understanding of land and where we belong and where we're allowed to be. And again and again and again, it roots us away from the preservation of our communities, our core values within our communities, the way in which we interact with each other. And this really does become the outputs of that ill that we need to overcome.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, but I want to go back to what you said right at the very beginning, and again a reminder to our listeners that it's going to take up too much time for me to sort of highlight the pertinent points of the past few conversations, but this really is at the core of it. When you spoke about, and you mentioned the collective, now you mention it repeatedly. Last week you mentioned this, when you referred to the youth of 1976, you spoke about histories of solidarity, and I think for me a core part of this mind shift that we speak about when we want to shift to this counterculture to bullying. Would be these two aspects, the core values. You referred to it right in our first segment when you said the second leg of Ubuntu is ethics. And this is exactly why I referred to earlier on at the start of this conversation, this idea of, am I complicit in enabling bullying? So this dilemma of asking oneself, if I'm obedient, am I responding ethically, to being bullied. So core values and ethical behavior is not also within our societal norms. It doesn't always come easily, and I think that for me comes across so clearly from what you are saying. It's a reminder of that it doesn't mean necessarily it's the easy way. It's going to be the uncomfortable way. It's going to be the way that means we need to sit and we need to ask ourselves difficult questions in as far as how and when do we enable it. Are we kind beings? Are we respectful beings? Are we empathetic beings? But it's a large part of this, as a collective, to let everything be imbued with these core values. But part of that conversation is then also a very important, and you start with that, Daniel, what it looks like. What it looks like for us, what as parents, as communities, as schools, when we speak about shifting towards this counterculture, so that everything we do, decisions we make, would be imbued with these core values.
Well, look at it in the structure of even this interview that we're doing with each other, right? I mean, you're speaking to a person who has vision, who has an understanding, but he gives a lot in a short period of time, right? And so there's a danger of Daniel going on tangents and missing the point, or missing the listener. And on the other hand, I have you, who's an
Who does
expert in
exactly the
regards to
same thing?
interviewing.
Who does
Yeah,
exactly the same thing?
yeah. But in this role, you're the listener. Sorry, you're the facilitator, the
Mm,
holder. You've got constantly in your mind the idea of what is the listener thinking. Is this clear to the listener? Let's bring Daniel back towards the original principles. You see, if we dissect that a little bit, what we see is that there are blind spots to each of us. So for me, it's about digging deep into my own thinking and my own ideas, and doing that in a dialogue with you, where I'm opening myself up to being critiqued, engaged with. Is this pie in the sky, or is this practical? And so my blind spots are held by you. Now, if I come into the interview defensive, entitled, wanting to look good in front of the listeners, then that energy will transfer into the responses that I have. If I start to have an attitude, it's going to play into the responses that I have. And so it's so important for me to come into this interview humble, and respectful that I'm coming into your space. And these are the core values that we're talking about. And then my humanity, if you like, of spending an exuberant amount of hours with people and dealing with these problems, gets a spotlight, gets an opportunity to be heard by the listeners, by the community. And in a sense, I'm stuck as a community member in my therapy room, but you provide, you and the producers and the brilliant people who came up with 786 from its inception, the history and the proud history of 786. It's that creates a platform in order to be able to not only preserve but celebrate the work that I do, which in that sense means that you and your team are celebrating my humanity. Now that is Ubuntu.
mm,
My humanity is in the way in which I cannot own my own humanity, because if I do, I'm ego driven. I'm success driven. I've become a salesperson, and we know we don't trust salespeople. But
mm,
it's you who gives me my humanity, and it's I hopefully who give you your humanity, and that's the core values that we talk about. On top of that as well is realizing that ambition doesn't have to be a selfish thing. Ambition can be to create an environment change in Cape Town that goes beyond the idea of it is what it is,
yeah.
what's the use? I can't complain. What's the use? And saying no, that's oppressive. I don't need to be thinking like that. It kills any opportunity for imagination, engagement, and creativity. And so together we sit there, and I love the fact that you call it a journey. There's no expectation that Daniel's got the answer for it. Um, but there is an expectation that if we engage on this topic with the right people, with the smart people that are thinking that often don't get the limelight, we have a much better opportunity together through diversity in order to generate thinking and thought patterns that support it. I think a bit like it's a bit like Rassi realizing that the majority of his backline comes from Cape Town, comes from people whose parents probably supported the All Blacks and so
Mm,
got brought up on All Blacks rugby. And Rassi and his geniusness, instead of sort of sitting there with, oh, we have to keep our identity, we have to keep our identity,
yeah.
goes and hires the All Blacks coach that created that kind of flowing rugby that our Springbok backline watched in their youth days, and integrates it as a part of us and acknowledges that it's a part of us. It's that kind of thinking. Don't tolerate each other, integrate.
Yeah, now, integrating then obviously entails choosing kindness and courage over silence, over conformity, over complicity. Um, so that would
But
be for.
rem-
So that would
but
be for
remember
those.
that. But
Yes.
remember that. Sorry, I'm interjecting.
No, carry on.
But it's important to state this: is remember that silence and complicity are trauma responses. So remember that the reason why we're silent, the reason why we sometimes become complicit is because it's so tough to talk about the traumas and the hurt that we had to endure. And it's not like apartheid ended in 1991. The hallmarks of apartheid are still there. The structural violence, the prejudice,
Yeah.
the superiority inferiority complex, where your kids can go to school. In the country of your birth, there's certain places that you cannot access. The Ritz Hotel in London is accessible to everybody if you can afford it. That kind of nonsense. That is still here, and that's still every day. I'm thinking of the brilliant book from Wachby Long, Nation on the Couch, where he speaks about this in this chapter, Envy, a really must read for those who want to explore this area further. But it's about that. It's about, and that trauma that you experience as a result of having to live under conditions that are hypothetical at best. And we treat them like they're physical. I think of the work of Rick Turner. We treat them like inequality is like a mountain that you can't go through. But I've been through the Huguenot tunnel. We can put a tunnel through a mountain. This is not a mountain. This is not a tangible physical thing that we can't get through. This is hypothetical. It's a mindset. It's a mind shift that unfortunately we've implemented into policy documents. But it can also be undone. But it gets undone through our biggest ability as a species, which is our ability to be creative and our imagination. And that's what we got to invigorate. In fact, I would say even more important than kindness is imagination. We've got to be allowed to be creative again. We've got to celebrate being a hustle culture. Hustling is the best thing in the world. If you look at things like the biggest innovations over the last period of time, companies that came out of nowhere. It's hustling, but it's hustling that is appreciated in its geniusness, which is creativity and ambition in restricted situations that comes with something so strong and so powerful.
Yeah, no, that's an incredibly important point to make. That the idea that these are these are trauma responses, but that if one conforms or if one seems complicit, and that sort of, as we said earlier, that push pull between shall I be quote unquote obedient, but now that this also brings us into another part of this conversation, as you were talking now about the as we think about this movement, we in every conversation we've spoken about how the one that's being bullied, but very importantly also when you mention now the fact that as parents also and as communities we need to remind ourselves that those incidents that we see, those are snapshots of what is happening within society, and then of course we need to turn our attention to those that are the bullies, and we want to speak about that and speak about behavior and role modeling and and role modeling behavior. So now we think about how do we then, part of this movement would be to, and I invite you to use the right terms, Daniel, when we speak about restorative approaches, when we speak about preventative, when we speak about managing the bully and the behavior of the bully. We said in the introduction, this idea of bystanders becoming upstanders. So that's one part of one side of the coin. But then these anti-bullying values or managing the bullying, when one is so angry if one has been a victim or one's child has been a victim, because that's a part of the conversation that's as important.
And like we said in the previous interview, we have to be angry. We must stop this nonsense of anger is uncivilized. I think it's a very colonial thinking. It's a colonial relation of dependency. Anger is important. Anger is vital. Anger is not the problem. It's what we do with our anger that's the problem. One thing that's sometimes I'm thinking of Shahida Janssen's important work around masculinity with the men's groups that happen in observatory, is that when we're living in an impulse environment, and I think, that the reality of the situation is that for large numbers of our population in Cape Town, gunshots sounds is a regular occurrence. Violence, interpersonal violence, is an ongoing occurrence. Hence why Debbie Kaminer and Joel Eagle's work on not calling it post-traumatic stress disorder, but continuous stress, continuous traumatic stress is important, because there's no end to it. And even though we might have climatized to it and it might have become normalized for such high number of our population, I can tell you that the physiological impact and the neurophysiological impact will still be there. Hence why we get increased numbers of cardiovascular disorders later on in life, because the heart rate and the body is constantly responding to trauma, which we have to silence. And I think also is obedience is not by choice, much like it is for what we said, the person who is suffering the bullying, is that obedience is not a choice. Of course not. They would never choose obedience. But obedience becomes a survival technique. And because the other options have not been given to that person by the community. And that's what it's about. It's about offering choices, offering viable choices towards health, not towards being subjugated or subjected at. I think I created a word there accidentally. And I think in line with that is we cannot expect our children to be able to do it if we're not able to do it ourselves first. And that's where it becomes so important, is we don't have to be obedient if we respond collectively. And that's the difficulty, because in that case, that's where psychology's role becomes depleted, because psychology likes to work one-on-one. Not all the time. Shahida is a good example of that, of group work and community work, which is where South African psychology evolves into, community psych approach. But the thing is, the answer is within the collective. But I feel like I hit my blind spot. I'm gonna silence myself now because I realize I've gone way off points and can't seem to get back in. So I'm hoping that my facilitator will guide me back to the ground where I need to go.
No, the difficult thing is that with your, what you call diversions or digressions, it takes us into areas that we realize is as important to the conversation. The one thing that we pledged not to do right at the start of this, Daniel, is that we're not going to have a sort of a plaster conversation. It's not going to be a knee-jerk response. It's absolutely imperative that we realize what our collective histories have done to us. As parents also, the sorts of children that we raise, what apartheid has done to us, what the colonial legacy has done to us, and the fact that certain laws have changed, that doesn't mean that we are not conditioned to respond in particular ways. You're absolutely right. And you again, you mentioned Dr. Shahida Janssen's work, exactly one of the reasons why we also had a series with her, because she helped us to understand, when we spoke about male behavior, why is it that males, respond in particular ways? That yes, a lot of it is biological, it's physiological, but it has everything to do with our histories. So for us to speak about what do these, when we refer to these terms, what does it look like? So also, of course, an important part of this conversation is for this to not remain there in the realm of, the ideal, this is what ought to be. We need to speak about what is before we can get to the what ought to be. And of course, we as parents, as community members, we are as much a part of this conversation as those learners, and we are as much a part of the snapshot as those learners. And so the question is not specific and the comment is not specific, but hopefully that in some way or the other you've collected your thoughts and gathered your thoughts so that you know where we ought to go
Yes.
from here.
So, thank you so much for that. You brought me right back to myself in regards to the beginning, and I'm making reference to this constantly for the listener as well, because I want it to be so strongly clear is that it's the intersection between the two of us that allows for the goal to come out of this. But this was the point I was going to make, was when we live in an impulse-driven society, and I feel that unless there's some enormous changes, especially economic, we're going to be stuck, is that if we're forced to live in an impulse world, we don't have the opportunity, or we have forgotten the ability to be able to sit and hold. So something that comes out in the therapy room quite often, and it's quite crazy that it goes like this, is when somebody insults me, so insults the core of me, and I feel like I have to defend myself. Because remember, in a previous interview, I said to you that often the rage that comes from the bully side doesn't come from a self-entitled, but actually comes from anxiety. They're anxious. Something needs to be protected at all costs, otherwise everything disintegrates for them. So in that vulnerability, which is a toxic vulnerability, it's a pathology, it's a psychopathology, but in that anxiety, right, if I feel that my core is being attacked, I immediately go into fight mode. All right. The problem is that I go into fight mode in order to prove, don't mess with me. Don't mess with me. The difficulty in that is that for some reason, we see physical boom as the most powerful thing. And so we think that if, like, for example, if somebody throws a punch at me, I feel I have to retaliate, otherwise my reputation is on the line. When in actual fact, we've learned this over and over and over and over again. I mean, just experience it for yourself. But the ability to be able to stand strong in the face of hostility and still be standing with full self-control, that worries people. If I'm able to have self-control in that moment, not back down, not be obedient or compliant, but to be able to stand firm, that is the height of power, self-control. And it's not for nothing that if we look in our faiths, if we look in our in the Quran, for example, as much as it would be in most other religious texts as well, the importance of self-control, the core value of self-control is so vitally important. Now, from a neurological perspective, that happens when we're able to go from an impulse-driven response that is always the initial response of how the world comes to us. We are able to allow it to go through the emotional brain, which is our amygdala, which is our ability to be able to sense the relationships, the dynamics, the umoya, if you like, between our engagements. That again informs us of the situation, because sometimes we have to read between the lines. But then it needs to move from the impulse through the emotional into the rational. And it's in the rational minds, in the way in which I can hold it, make sense of it, like we're doing here today, that's where wisdom is grown. And that doesn't mean that the rational brain has to supersede the other two parts. It's actually more about a balance, that all three parts of us, our impulsive need to respond, our emotional sense of what is being hurt in us, and our rational mind of what is the bigger picture, how can I most effectively use my anger so that I don't create more problems, more difficulties, more destruction. And I think that that's the difficulty here is the families of those and the community members of those who love the kids that are being bullied, their anger, half the problem is that their anger is not being heard. Who should be listening to their anger? The people that can exact change. So, in other words, their anger, they feel as if their anger goes on deaf ears within the schools, whereas in the sense of that in the schools, they're not being heard, they're not being appreciated. And I think a lot of that comes down to the structures. We have to rethink the structures. We have to rethink the school governance body I mean, the last few times that I've been invited to go in there, it feels more like a courtroom than it does about a community hall, and there's a big problem there. We have to and on top of that it's also in regards with the Department of Education. And I know that a little bit in regards to my own experience with Department of Health is that, again, it's not as much the individuals as it is the structures that we've inherited. We've inherited structures where you can have a career in health, you can have a career in a decision-making position in health and never see one person on ground level your whole career. That is very possible.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And we know as well is that not being listened to on ground level is a vital problem and a problem within the cog of our whole system. I can give you an example from Department of Health. When the Ombudsman released a report on the Life Esidimeni disaster, which shouldn't be called the Life Esidimeni disaster, it should be called Gauteng Health Department's disaster. The disaster is on the wrong person.
Yeah.
But when that Ombudsman report came out, one of the main causes for why the disaster took place was because those in power did not listen to the clinicians. So this not listening is an issue. And this over-reliance that we have of politicians exacting changes within our school structures, within our societies, is also a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, the easiest way to prove that to your listeners is if you were in an accident and you could choose, either you have a doctor come onto the scene or the Minister of Health come onto the scene. Who would you rather come to you in your moments of need? And there shows you exactly the expertise that we have on ground level as community members, because sometimes we don't see those in power as our community members, that they've been out of the community for too long.
It's true.
But I mean, myself, I'm a psychologist, but I'm very much in the community. Every day I'm there, in my office. Come visit me. We can talk.
No, exactly. It's exactly because you're a part of the community that we can draw so much value from this conversation. Because the idea of, people who then sit in ivory towers and hence my comment earlier on about the what ought to be and all of these conversations remaining there in an abstract realm where it seems as if, it's just so out of reach and unfathomable for most of us. I want to we need to end. Yeah, we need to end. We need to continue next week. I just want to make one quick comment. The fact that you bring this very, very important part, and again, we spoke about histories, you bring our spirituality into this and speaking about that. And again, it reminds us that this is such an important part of this conversation, the multifaceted human being, the physical, you spoke about that, the physical responses, the emotional, the psychological, but also our being a person of faith and how we ought to respond, and so how all of these interweave with one another, the importance of then being measured and how core that is. So it speaks about so many gaps within our society, within our community, that yes, we in our home spaces, we absolutely need to address. It's been so insightful, Daniel. I wish we had more time.
We'll make as much time as we need. I'm not going anywhere. So even if we need to go on a few more journeys, we'll do that.
We'll continue. Ons weet
But
jy
I
is
think-
hier in die gemeenskap, jy is net die ander kant die pad. Daniel, thank you again.
But
I'm so looking forward to continuing with these conversations and with this journey next week. Daniel Den Hollander, have yourself a beautiful day. Goodbye. That, of course, Daniel Den Hollander, a clinical psychologist, as we're continuing on this journey to unmask bullying. Stay with us on 100.4 FM. The 10 o'clock news follows.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.